What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today I'm going to be sharing a handful of tips to help you improve your overall awareness of enemy locations in Warzone. Now for some of these tips, I'll admit they will be fairly obvious to people that are super dedicated and have been playing Warzone for a long time. However, there are others where even for dedicated players, they'll probably pick a thing or two up from this video. Now without further ado, let's just hop right into the list, which is in no particular order by the way. And let's start it off with the call out that you'll get when an enemy calls in a UAV.
Enemy UAV overhead.
This actually gives you quite a bit more information than you might think. This callout will only happen if an enemy calls a UAV in within 250 meters of you. So it doesn't happen anytime anyone on the map calls a UAV in. They have to be within 250 meters of you, which is the exact radius of the UAV in this game, and therefore that means you will be exposed if you don't have Ghost to that UAV player. But with that in mind, if you hear that callout and you pull up your map, there's actually a fairly quick reference we can use. On the map, we do have a grid system, and if we overlay a 250 meter radius circle over top of one of those squares, this is what it looks like. So just as a rough indication, if you hear that an enemy UAV is inbound, that means they are roughly within a square of you. So shift one of those squares over to your position in your head, and the enemy player that just called the UAV in is somewhere within that rough radius of the square. Now, we can take this a step further and start looking at player behavior to narrow this down a little bit. And when you think about it, most of the time when a UAV is called in, it's going to be called in right next to a buy station. The average player out there, when they go to buy a UAV, the moment they buy it, they're going to pop that UAV to see what's around them. So therefore, if you have a buy station within 250 meters of you, and you hear that an enemy UAV is inbound, it's very likely that at the moment they called that in, they were right next to that buy station. Now, of course, this doesn't account for every situation, and you are playing the odds here. This isn't going to apply if an enemy happened to get lucky and get a UAV out of one of those loot crates around the map, or if an enemy had maybe bought two UAVs, called one in the moment they bought it, and then saved another one in their inventory for later. Of course, it's not going to account for those situations. But we are playing the odds here, and more often than not, somebody's going to be calling a UAV in within the immediate vicinity of a buy station. Next up, let's get a fairly obvious one out of the way. This one's for the more beginner players or players that just haven't noticed this little detail. If you're playing a squad-based mode and you see a red flare pop in the air at a buy station, that means somebody has just bought their teammate back from the dead, so that means somebody is on that buy station when that red flare goes up, and also that means you should be looking to the sky for somebody dropping in. Additionally, on that same note, if you see a yellow flare go in the air, this means that somebody is standing right below that doing a recon contract, with the only exception being recon contracts on the train, because the flare will pop up in the location that it's activated at the time on the train. However, the train will continue moving, so the flare will remain in the same spot, but the player will continue moving with the train. Next up, something that's really important to remember when you're dropping into a match is the flight path of the drop plane at the beginning of the map. This isn't just important at the beginning of the game to figure out where you want to drop to. This is also important as you get to the mid and later game situations, because it tends to give you a good indication of where most players will be landing and where the majority of players will be concentrated. When it comes to this, the vast majority of players are going to be dropping within about 700 to 800 meters in either direction of this drop path. Of course, there will be some outliers that stretch beyond that. I often like stretching beyond that. So this isn't one of those perfect rules that works 100% of the time. This is more so to give you an indication of hotspots where enemies will tend to land, and you can use that information later in the game, because after you get through your initial fights, now you got to be thinking, where are those players going to go once they finish looting the area they've landed in? What path are they likely to take? Which direction are they likely to move in? And this information can be quite important as you move into the mid game, especially if you're actively going out and hunting for the kills. Additionally, on that same note, if you wanted to take this to the next level, this is something you can choose to do or not. Instead of dropping straight to the ground and trying to be the first one on the ground as soon as possible, sometimes it's in your best interest to hover a little bit with your parachute and just watch where the general distribution of players tends to be going. As players are skydiving in at the beginning, they have that smoke trail that goes behind them, and this allows you to get a general trend of where the majority of the map is going. Or you might catch that one strange guy that's going to a weird spot of the map, and you can keep all of this in the back of your head as you progress through the match. You can think, like, I did see a guy land over to the north, for instance, even though it was so far away from the circle, so I'm going to have to be aware of that guy as the circle starts to close in. Either that, or you could see a giant group of people landing at one particular area, and you know that that's going to be a big hotspot. Speaking of hotspots, this brings us to the next tip, and this is one that more so just comes with experience, and most experienced players will be well aware of this already. And this is just always try to pay attention to patterns over time with where enemies tend to gravitate toward. So an example of this is if you're immediately dropping in, a large portion of the map will tend to drop toward the Superstore area. That's one of the hottest drop zones in the map, and therefore in most matches you can reasonably expect a bunch of people to be landing there. Or even beyond the initial drop, later in the game, there's certain hills or vantage points or rooftops that are very common for enemies to be gravitating toward because they are power positions. And it's important to recognize these patterns. If you consistently see players going to this certain building or this certain hilltop or something like that, then through experience, you'll start to realize that those are areas that you should be consistently checking and being aware of and highlighting them in your mind as a danger zone before even realizing that somebody is actually there in that particular game. Next up, let's talk about the Cluster Strike and Precision Airstrike. And we'll start it off with the Cluster Strike. When you call one of these in, the cluster will tend to originate from the point that it's called in, and then it will travel from that direction toward the target. So if you see a cluster on the map moving from the right side of the map to the left side of the map to reach its point of impact, that means the player that called that in the vast majority of situations, is going to be located in the direction of the point of origin of that Cluster Strike. On top of this, if that cluster is moving quite a large distance from its point of origin to its point of impact, that tends to mean that that player was quite far away from the target when they called the Cluster Strike in. So not only do you get directional data, it also gives you a little bit of data on the distance that the enemy player is from the point of impact on the Cluster Strike. Because if that player were to call that Cluster Strike right in directly on their location, the clusters are going to be coming basically straight down from their point of origin, and that will tell you that that player basically just called that cluster in on themselves. So yeah, that's some very valuable information you can get on Cluster Strikes, and that does tend to be very consistent. And we do see a fairly similar story with the Precision Airstrike, however, it's just not quite as consistent. When it comes to calling a Precision Airstrike in, the airstrike will always try to come in from the same direction it was called in at. So the point of origin of the planes tends to be in line with the player that called that in, and therefore it can often give you a good indication of the direction of that player. However, this is less reliable, like I said, because if there's any kind of an obstruction preventing the airstrike from dealing concentrated damage on that point of impact that you've selected, it can and will alter the flight path accordingly. So in this situation right here, for instance, if the planes would have come in from the direction that I called this Precision Airstrike in from, it wouldn't actually have dealt any damage directly on the point that I selected. Therefore, the planes actually came in from the exact opposite direction of the point of origin in order to better hit that location. So this rule basically gets thrown out of the window if you're like downtown, for instance, because the buildings will be constantly obstructing things from multiple angles. However, if you're in more open terrain, this tends to be pretty accurate in predicting the location of the enemy player that called that airstrike in. Next up, another thing that good players already tend to know about, but less experienced players may not have really considered or thought about a whole lot. This is when you open up your map, pay attention to the vehicle locations, especially when you're in like a mid-game situation. Those vehicle locations could give you an indication of where an enemy is or at least has been fairly recently. The main thing you want to be looking for is vehicles that are clearly not in spawn points. And part of this does come down to experience and just learning where the spawn points of vehicles are and where they aren't. But also, you can usually tell when a vehicle's out of place and it's obviously not in a spawn point. Like if it's angled in a strange way that is like straight toward a building or something like that, usually they don't spawn vehicles that way. But knowing that a vehicle is out of place at least lets you know that somebody has been there. It unfortunately doesn't let you know when that player was there, so it's not perfect information, but it's at least something that can help your overall awareness, especially when you combine it with many of the other elements from this video. Now, moving on, let's get into those free loadout drops that drop around the map. I have talked about these in the past and shared how they work, but I felt like it was important to include in this video as well. It turns out these loadout drops will always try to drop within 200 meters of you, and if there are multiple loadouts that drop together, that means there's another enemy or team that was within 200 meters of that location at the moment that those started dropping from the sky. And it's often in your best interest to also know the timings of these free loadout drops so you can be prepared to look toward the sky as they all start dropping from the sky. Because then you can see not only your loadout drop and any that might drop with it, but you can see where other loadout drops are going around the map if you've got a good eye. And that information can be very useful as you progress. If you see a massive cluster of like 5 loadout drops dropping in one location, that means that is a very hot zone and there are multiple teams or enemies within 200 meters of that location. So yeah, that moment those loadout drops come in, that's actually a very key moment for awareness if you want that extra information. Next up, just a really quick tip that I've noticed after spectating a lot of players that apparently a lot of people don't realize. If you are trying to hunt somebody that has a most wanted contract on them, so they're appearing as a little crown on the map, if you ping that player by opening up your map, even if they're inside a building and you don't have a line of sight on them, you will get a live ping on their location. You will see exactly where they are, not only where they are on the minimap, but in the actual game itself. You'll see their exact elevation and literally their exact position through a wall. And in doing so, sometimes you can just wallbang that player. If they're sitting in a corner up in an attic, for instance, just ping them on your map. And if they happen to be next to a wall that can be shot through, light them up. It's a free kill. As for the next tip I've got for you guys to help improve your awareness, this is pay attention to the contract locations on your map. If you happen to notice that a contract was in a location and maybe you were on your way toward that and it suddenly disappeared, that means an enemy player has picked that contract up and therefore there was an enemy player there. Additionally, if you're approaching a point of interest that just has like no contracts on the ground, that means there were likely multiple enemies there at some point, taking those contracts and picking them up, and therefore you're getting into an area that's likely already been looted, and there could potentially be players there at the moment. Whereas on the flip side of that, if you're approaching a location that's got tons and tons of contracts, especially the more highly sought after contracts like scavengers or bounties, then that usually means that it's a fairly safe area and there's still going to be plenty of loot there and you don't have to be as nervous approaching that as if you were entering an area with no contracts available. But finally, and possibly most importantly from a match-to-match basis, a great method for predicting enemy movement and flow and also the hotspots and locations where enemies are going to be concentrated has to do with circle movements. This is something I have covered in the past, but it is worth revisiting because this is extremely important for most Battle Royale games. When it comes to this, you always want to be looking at the largest area outside of the circle as the gas is closing in, because that's going to be displacing any player that was in that area. They have to move into the circle or they're going to die. Let's just say this is the circle location right here, and the first round of gas is pushing in, and it's about to be closed right into the circle. There is going to be a massive concentration of players around this particular area of this circle and this outside edge, because anybody that was anywhere over here before the gas started coming in, they are now being pushed into the circle. The more offset that circle is, the more hot that zone tends to be. And you can do whatever you want with this information. You can either use this to hunt those players in those zones, which is very risky because there's going to be a lot of players, or you can use this information to stay away from those zones and try to avoid them so you don't get completely overwhelmed by multiple players or multiple teams. And this applies continuously throughout a match. Every time that circle shrinks, always look toward the widest side between the edge of the circle and the edge of the gas. As that closes in, that's generally going to be the hottest location on the map. Which of course means the opposite side of that, the opposite end of that circle, tends to be the coldest side of the map, where there's going to be fewer enemies. And if there's any tip out of this video to learn, this is probably the most important one because it works so consistently across so many different Battle Royale games. But yeah, with that, that's going to wrap it up for today's video. I'd like to hear from you guys in the comments section below. First up, were there any tips here that I provided today that you didn't realize or didn't really think about? And second, do you have any other tips, at least non-obvious tips, for helping to improve your awareness without cheating, of course? I know a lot of you guys are going to joke around and say, just use a wall hack. But I mean actual tips for legitimate players to improve their awareness in Warzone. Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.